Ready to go.
All right, greetings everyone. I'm Amy Antonucci, a New Hampshire Peace Action Board member, and I'm really glad to welcome you tonight to our Peace and Justice Conversation Series online on August 14th, 2023. A quick reminder about how we use Zoom. We love it when you keep your video on, although we understand if you don't want to, but ask that you stay muted unless it's your time to ask a question. Later on, when we get to Q&A, you can both use the chat and hands up. If you are new, let me update you that for over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all, based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, where mutual benefit and shared security lead to more peace and just for the global community. In that spirit of respect, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we here in New Hampshire do our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people. We honor with gratitude the land and the waterways and the people who have been in relationship here throughout the generations. Thanks to Indigenous New Hampshire for that graphic. This online conversation series began as a way to help us stay connected during the pandemic and to not stop finding ways to make the changes we've been yearning for. We have decided to keep offering it because both connection and change are just as much needed now, and it turns out that this forum has been a good way, a solid way to do some of that work. Tonight, our topic is peace on the Korean Peninsula. We just passed the 70th year mark of the Korean division and the existence of the demilitarized zone. So we wanted to mark that occasion and educate folks about where things are at now, especially given that the US has a real role in how this goes. We did have a last minute change in speakers. Jennifer from AFSC is sick, but her colleague, Hayden Smith, who was actually going to be here anyway to help talk a little bit about his work, has really kindly said yes to taking the lead on the conversation. So let me introduce him to you, since his bio was not out there before. So Hayden Smith actually grew up here in New Hampshire and is living here now, I understand. Hayden is a Korean American political organizer with the New England Korea Peace Campaign, which is a regional working group of Korean diaspora and allied community members pushing for a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War and for de-escalation of military tensions in Korea. He came to the struggle for peace and reunification in Korea by way of education in international solidarity spaces while a student in Washington, D.C. He was especially disturbed by lawmakers' perpetuation of militarization when he was interning at the US Congress. He got involved with Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network, which is KPNGN, in 2021. He also previously served as deputy political director for the New Hampshire Youth Movement, a progressive organization focusing on representing young people in state-level politics. Hayden actually reached out to us this spring about working together on some legislation around Korea. And so we're really excited to have found a way to get that started. What's going to happen tonight, Hayden will give us a presentation with some background info, and then we'll move on to some Q&A. After that, we're actually going to have an abbreviated action session. Hayden is going to lead us all in reaching out to our representatives because there is currently such important legislation in the House on this issue. So we're going to be recording the presentation and Q&A part, not the phone call part. So that's the plan. First off, we're going to have Hayden speak. Remember, you can use the chat at any time. We'll do hands up part a little bit later. But for now, help me welcome Hayden.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Amy. And I'm really happy to be here with you all. And thank you to New Hampshire Peace Action for giving this space. I'm really appreciative. As I said, I'm Hayden Smith, and I am a member of the New England Korea Peace Campaign, which is a local regional group affiliated with Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network, as well as Massachusetts Peace Action, so the NH Peace Action siblings to the south, around pushing for an official end to the Korean War and trying to de-escalate military tensions in Korea, specifically using our role here in the US to stop US aggression and escalation. As a bit of background, I grew up in Hanover, New Hampshire, where I currently live still. And I currently, where was I? Oh, I do, we've been doing a lot of regional organizing to get people across New England moved on Korea Peace Action, as well as trying to push our members of Congress around the legislation that we want to pass. Even though my name might not indicate it, I am half Korean. My mom was born in South Korea, and her family moved to the States in the early 1970s by way of Argentina, as a lot of Koreans who could not get visas to the US or Canada did, going through Latin America. But this work is really important to me because the Korean War is something that really shaped the trajectory for my family and for a lot of other Korean families and diaspora families. My grandfather was 19 when the Korean War broke out. He was conscripted into the South Korean army, and his family underwent a lot of suffering. His brother went to North Korea, and he is never heard from after the war. So there's the pain that a lot of divided families feel, and that's something that my grandfather continues to feel. My grandmother was born in Pyongyang and fled south during the war, but was separated from her mother. And by a lot of miracles, they were able to reunite in South Korea, but they were refugees in their own country. And that led to a lot of difficulties trying to get reestablished in a totally new place. And on top of that, my grandparents still continue to show the effects of growing up under famine. My grandfather would talk about only getting allotted one ball of rice as his ration each day. And that trauma lingers. Both he and a lot of other Korean elders that I know still stockpile food because of those lingering memories of famine. That's, I think, a long way of saying, and I hope not trauma dumping too much, that this work is really important because the Koreas do remain in an active state of war, and that is largely enabled and perpetuated by the United States. So that's why it's important that we do this work today. I guess I pulled up some slides for this event. So Will or whoever's pulling up can start screen sharing. And I wanted to say that echoing Amy, feel free to put any questions in the chat as we go along, but there will be some dedicated time for questions towards the end. I wanted to note that this is a very multi-organizational space. At the left is the logo for Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network, with which I'm affiliated, which is a large umbrella organization for multiple groups working around Korea Peace, from multiple ideological and cultural backgrounds. We have a lot of religious working groups, such as the United Methodist Church or the Mennonites, who do work with us. Additionally, I'm promoting what Jennifer, the original speaker, was here with, the American Friends Service Committee. And then lastly, New Hampshire Peace Action, of course, for putting on this event. And I'll note I have worked with Jennifer in the past, and we met for the first time in person 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C. for our national mobilization, which I'll speak more about later. but I'll try to bring as much of her energy to this as I can. And please wish her well as she's recovering from an illness. Anyhow, on to the next slide, please. So I'll just do a quick overview of what we'll be doing tonight. First, we'll review some very abbreviated history of the Korean War, as well as some recent developments in relationships between North Korea, South Korea, and the United States. Then I'll discuss a bit about what the Korea Peace Coalition's current work is looking like in the United States, with a special emphasis on the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, a bill we're currently trying to push through the US Congress that would commit the US to supporting a formal peace treaty to end the Korean War. We'll have some Q&A time, and then we'll jump into our action bank, where after a quick training, we'll push our members of Congress, for wherever you may live, to support this bill. And as part of that, we'll be calling 3 offices. So your 1 US House representative, as well as your 2 senators. And I'll be around to help you find your office if you don't know who your reps or your senators are. Train you through a call script, although you're welcome to speak on your own if you prefer. The script is just to help people who want it. And then we'll have some quick time for debrief and next steps. Does that sound good to everyone? Alrighty, let's dive in then to some history. And I did want to note, as with a lot of history surrounding armed conflict and violence, there will be some traumatic stuff that comes up. If you need to take some space, feel free to do so. Next slide, please. So again, this is an extremely condensed history, but wanted to provide this to folks who are not quite familiar with the history of Korea over the past century. For about 35 years officially, but in practice a little bit longer, Korea, which has for many, many centuries been one country, came under Japanese colonial occupation. It was a very bitter and difficult chapter in Korea's history, but it ended in 1945 at the conclusion of World War II. And actually tomorrow, August 15th, marks the anniversary of the end of Japanese colonial war in Korea, or colonial rule in Korea. But even though a lot of Koreans who have been working hard for liberation were expecting true independence at last, that unfortunately did not end up being the case. Soviet and American forces landed in Korea during and after the final weeks of World War II, and quickly set about trying to divide their spheres of influence in the country. Over time, tensions thickened, and by 1948, we have the official division of the peninsula along the 38th parallel, roughly cutting the peninsula in half. And 2 separate governments are declared. There's the US-backed Republic of Korea, or ROK, announced in the south, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK, in the north, backed by the Soviet Union. And these, both of these governments planned control over the whole peninsula and attempted to exert their control, but this led to a lot of violence, including a lot of insurrections that were violently put down in Korea, including by the US military government, particularly on Jeju Island, which there's still a lot of investigations going on to this day about the massacres and atrocities that happened, even leading up to the official start of the Korean War. Tensions kicked off fully in 1950 with what we call the hot phase of the Korean War. This is what you've probably heard of in the history books as the official Korean War. But in 1950, open fighting started, pulling in South Korea, North Korea, the UN command, which was represented by the United States as leader, and then later the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, a contingent from China. There was a lot of bitter fighting. Millions of Koreans died, as well as others who came in from the larger coalitions and allies. And the death toll is still not 100% certain to this day, but it was very high. And the Korean Peninsula was left extremely poor. And for several years, South Korea was actually one of the poorest countries in the world. And in 1953, there was an armistice agreement reached on July 27th. So as Amy mentioned, 70 years ago this year, between the UN command, represented by the US, the DPRK, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. This did end the most intense fighting, but this should not be mistaken with a peace treaty. Because this is just an armistice agreement, the Korean War does technically remain in progress to this day. So it now turns 73 this year, and that is why we still have so many fears about military escalation in Korea, because that's why we have the DMZ. That's why there's still armies lined up on both sides of the DMZ. That is why we still have mandatory conscription in both Koreas. And that is why we still have over 28,000 US troops stationed in Korea, including at Camp Humphreys, which is one of the largest, if not the absolute largest overseas US military installation. And over time, there have been oscillations in tensions building up and tensions thawing, which I'll go a bit more into in our recent events slide. But there's always a threat of war hanging over the Korean Peninsula, and that perpetuates a lot of trauma and fear. To zoom ahead to some of the more recent years, and I know I'm skipping over a lot of important history here. Starting in 2017, with the presidency of Moon Jae-in in South Korea, DPRK and ROK leaders attempted to thaw relations. And you might have seen some of this in the news, including Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un having multiple summits and meetups. And for a very confusing time, even US President Donald Trump gave some erratic and ultimately fleeting support to these talks. Unfortunately, and partly due to Trump not really coming to the negotiating table seriously, these talks collapsed. And then Trump subsequently went back to the status quo US approach to North Korea by banning Americans, particularly humanitarian workers, from traveling to North Korea after the unfortunate death of Otto Warmbier, who was an American student who took a trip to North Korea, was arrested for theft. And then when he returned to the US, he died from a medical condition. And that has been cited to instigate a lot of the latest US crackdown on North Korea. But I did want to note, while this was tragic, a lot of other Americans have been able to safely travel to North Korea. And I think Otto's death has been used unfairly as a pretext to stop a lot of important diplomacy and humanitarian work from happening. More recently, in 2022, we have now a right-wing pro-US administration in North Korea, led by now President Yoon Suk-yeol. And he has largely undone a lot of the diplomatic efforts engineered by President Moon. And he's also resumed the US-South Korea joint military exercises, which were a staple for many years and commonly used to intimidate North Korea. It's commonly thought that these are what motivated North Korea to become a nuclear state, due to the US constantly threatening decapitation of the North Korean leadership. And now with the Biden administration in office, they've been prioritizing further bringing South Korea under the US military and economic umbrella as part of a larger counter-China strategy. South Korea is just one piece in this. The US has also been building up its military presence across East Asia, including in Japan, in the Philippines, and so on. But South Korea has been treated as an especially big priority. And I think that shows in some of the latest actions, including Biden sending more U.S. naval forces to South Korea, including 2 nuclear submarines just these past few months. And Biden actually next week will be sitting down for or actually not even next week, this week, will be sitting down for a trilateral summit at Camp David in Maryland with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in an attempt to broker a trilateral alliance, which is an unprecedented thing, both in Korea, because trying to put them into a military relationship with their former colonial occupier, as well as with Japan, because Japan, there's been a lot of talk of abandoning Japan's embrace of pacifism after World War II in an attempt to rearm its military more fully. Next slide, please. And just to emphasize like how a lot of this is playing out right now in front of us and how urgent this is. For one thing, starting next Monday, we'll have the Ochi Freedom Shield drills, which are one of the largest US-South Korea joint exercises, and that will include 12 other countries where they'll have massive naval, air, and ground exercises for simulating a war with North Korea. And then you see here also the trilateral summit between US, South Korea, and Japan. Next slide, please. I know I'm running a little bit tight on time, so I'll try to breeze through these, but now you know a little bit about the situation. And now I wanted to talk about why it's important that we do work here in the US around Korea peace. As US residents, we need to force our government to stop military escalation in Korea and instead pledge itself to a path to peace. Part of the deal is we can't have a binding peace agreement in Korea without the US signing off on it. China pulled out of the armistice agreement and back in the 1990s. So now it's solely up to the US representing the UN command and North Korea to officially end the war. South Korea is not a party to this treaty, or sorry, not a party to the armistice. So if we do want to officially end the war, it has to be on the US's initiative. And more just broadly, we don't want war. We don't want to put our military members, we don't want to put our own country, and we don't want to put South Koreans and others or North Koreans at risk of a lot of the tragedies of war that we're all too familiar with from the past few decades. So some of the steps that our broad Korea Peace Coalition has been taking, we've been trying to push for meaningful public diplomacy. So this includes trying to reunite divided families, so families that were divided by the Korean War, and especially for a lot of aging people, including my grandfather, for example, who have siblings or loved ones in North Korea that they haven't gotten to see. This is a good way of both mending families and building greater diplomatic ties. Another platform for this has been repatriating US service members' remains that are still in North Korea back to the US, building more understanding and kindness around that. I also wanted to mention humanitarian aid and sanctions relief. The US does have an extremely aggressive sanctions regime on North Korea that doesn't just target the military or the government, but civilians too. It's a blanket sanctions board. So on top of that, Trump instituted a travel ban that prevents humanitarian workers from going to North Korea. I do have a very awesome comrade here on the call who I did want to open up some space to, if you'd like to be able to speak on this, the LIFT campaign. Becca, if you're able to come on, and okay if not, I did want to ask, or even if you just wanted to drop in the chat, any words about the LIFT campaign or some of the work around sanctions and the travel ban. I think Becca might be off, might have some connections. Okay, gotcha. And that is completely my fault because I did not consult Becca, give much advance notice. But if you have any stuff you want to pop in the chat, feel free to do so because you do a lot of awesome stuff. Um, Furthermore, we want to end US RFK war drills, and we want to push for a binding peace treaty to formally end the Korean War, which allows me to segue to our next slide. Some of the legislation we're trying to push through the US Congress right now. For the past few years, our coalition's been working on the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which I'll have more details on next slide. But since 2018, roughly, we've been pushing some iteration of this bill, primarily in the US House, but we've also been trying to interact with US senators to get a bill introduced in their chamber, which has been harder. So what some of the actions that we'll be taking for our action date later tonight will be pushing our US House reps to support the current iteration of the bill this year, HR 1369, as well as to push our senators to introduce a counterpart to that in the Senate. And thank you, Amy, for dropping the link to the bill in the chat. Next slide, please. So what is the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act? This is a bill that calls for diplomacy in pursuit of a binding peace agreement to end the Korean War. So putting on a congressional mandate on the executive branch to make it official US policy for the end of the Korean War by a peace treaty. Specifically, it urges the Secretary of State to pursue negotiations with North Korea and to establish liaison offices in the DPRK and in the United States, so we have better diplomatic channels. It also does call on the Secretary of State to review travel restrictions on Americans, particularly humanitarian workers trying to get to North Korea. And I have some Korean instruction here from earlier, but if you do read Korean, that is awesome. Next slide, please. This year, we introduced HR 1369 at the beginning of March with Congressman Brad Sherman of California. We have 34 total sponsors. So that includes, as a New Hampshire right here, I'm glad to say that Representative Annie Custer finally signed on to the bill this year. But we have a pretty strong slate here, primarily Democrats, but one Republican. And that includes 6 members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to which the bill is currently assigned. Even though we want to bring in as many reps as possible to co-sponsor this bill, it's especially important that we get reps on the Foreign Affairs Committee because we need their support in order to get a hearing on this bill and eventually a vote. And I want to uplift what is some of the links are being dropped in the chat by Amy and Becca. First about the Lift the Travel Ban campaign, as well as if you want to see the official co-sponsor list for the bill. But if you recognize any of your reps on here, feel free to drop it in the chat. Otherwise, we can move on to the next slide, please. So I know that was a lot of information, and I want to give perhaps the next 5 minutes, I know I'm running a little bit over time, to see if people had questions, either about the general history, the kind of work that Korea Peace Now, AFSC, and the other coalition members do, or about the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act specifically. I'm no Jennifer, but I'll do my best to answer questions. So feel free to raise your hand or pop a question in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much, Hayden. We're going to give folks a minute to gather their thoughts, and then Will and I are Will's going to watch the chat and read us off any questions that come in. Will, do you have a question? Is that what that hand up? I thought I saw your hand up.
No, I was just turning on my camera. At the moment, I had some questions about the AFSC program in Korea and if that's still ongoing, but I'm not sure. Those were questions I had for Jennifer. I'm not sure if you know, Hayden. Does AFSC still have aid workers on the ground in North Korea?
I don't know if they have them right now. I know okay, I see Jenny shaking her head. And Jenny, feel free to come off mute or pop in the chat if you have any stuff that you would like to add. But I guess the answer is currently no. Jennifer worked pretty extensively in the DPRK, but I believe the current travel ban that's been imposed by the Trump administration and upheld by the Biden administration has just made things very hard. And one thing that stood out to me is even if you're a dual citizen, you can't get into, it's very hard to get into North Korea if you just hold a US passport. You can't get in with your other country's passport. Jenny, did you have any stuff you wanted to add there? Not to put you on the spot too much.
I'm not a member of AFSC, so I can't speak to that, but I do know that humanitarian aid workers have not been present in the country since the end of January 2020, and that's been primarily due to the COVID closures of the North Korean border. So that's the North Korean government that has limited access. Those border restrictions will be opening again soon. And so we've been asking the US government to lift the travel ban so that we could resume humanitarian aid as soon as those borders are open and not have to have administrative delays due to the red tape that the US has put in place to keep us from gaining access.
Thank you, Jenny. So there are a couple questions in the chat, and I'll read them in the order they're coming in. The first one's from Chris Hansen. He says, besides arms makers, who benefits from the current lack of a peace agreement?
That is an excellent question. I think, for one thing, a lot of large companies in both South Korea and in the US that are not arms makers, although the arms makers are certainly an important player, do benefit from the current state of things just because of the lack of a peace agreement. And now with US-China escalation, US economic involvement in South Korea has been very big. And with some of the large companies, the chaebols, as you might have heard, these are large conglomerates that control large portions of the South Korean economy. There's a lot of related manufacturing and production that goes on for related to the US presence in South Korea. I know that especially around US bases, such as Camp Humphreys, there have been economies that have sprung up around those bases for entertaining or flying soldiers. And certainly a lot of locals have been exploited by, I think, some more powerful people trying to make money off the US soldiers. And that includes things like prostitution and other abuse that's been going on. Additionally, I do think that under the current government in Japan does have an interest in the current lack of a peace agreement, because they are the current ruling government there is also very closely entwined with the US military presence, and having that means more investment and support in their country because they are viewed as a bulwark against North Korea and against China.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I was just going to move. I thought you were done, but if you have more to say, go ahead.
Oh, no, that is all.
Okay. Next question from Greg. He says, might you say something about the development of North Korea's nuclear weapons and to what extent the US contributed to North Korea building a nuclear arsenal?
Thank you for asking that, Greg. And I think the US did have a major contribution in pushing North Korea to develop that arsenal. Because I think by having repeated war drills and other simulations where they practice how they are going to remove the North Korean government's leadership, that scared the North Korean government and is what pushed them to build a nuclear arsenal in the first place. They view it as their means of self-defense. And I think a lot of the saber rattling they do is more motivated by fear of being attacked and trying to stop any US incursions than by wanting to launch any preemptive attacks. Obviously, nuclearization is a dangerous thing, but I think this was something that a choice that the US kind of forced on North Korea. And it is worth noting that the US has stationed a whole variety of weapons in South Korea for ostensible use against North Korea should the occasion arise. That includes, I think, more recently, the THAAD missile system, which there were a lot of protests against that in South Korea by locals in the place where these missile installations are being set up. Ultimately, I think if the US wants to get North Korea to stop building up its nuclear program, it has to take the first step of drawing down its own military presence in the Korean Peninsula, or at least being less outwardly aggressive. But they're not really doing that right now. I think last year there was the RIMPAC drill, which was a large exercise of multiple countries from around the Pacific practicing war exercises, and it was discovered that the scenario that they were practicing was a decapitation of the North Korean government, and that includes like having houses where the soldiers or practice houses where the soldiers were raiding with portraits of North Korean leaders.
So question from Kyle Marston. The history of U.S. diplomatic relations with North Korea involves specifically NBA players, Dennis Rodman. North Korea has also been willing to show up to World Cups. How do you perceive the future of soft power diplomatic engagement through sport? I think that's a great question. Do you think there's a place for sport in that kind of diplomatic relation?
I think so. I know that one really uplifting moment back during the Winter Olympics in, I believe it was Pyeongchang, were when they had the shared DPRK ROK women's hockey team, and that was a big moment of national unity, and I think it was part of President Moon's big push for diplomacy. And I think soft power, like sport, definitely has a role to play. Unfortunately, I don't see much of it happening right now under the current Yoon administration. But I think it's definitely an avenue for the future, especially through sports. And in a future World Cup or Olympic tournament, if there was to be another joint team, I think that'd be an excellent move. And I know that the involvement of NBA players like Dennis Rodman drew its fair share of controversy in the US, but I, for one, think it is a valid way of trying to build some of those important human connections that we need to have, because oftentimes the media makes out North Korea to be just a place where people are completely alien. And yes, the DPRK has many problems, but we should not be isolating the people and treating them as not human. And having these things is a good way of softening these prejudices that we felt. And I also want to just echo what Jenny has put in the chat most recently about nuclear weapons too, for Greg's previous question.
I was actually going to invite Jenny to talk a little bit about that if you're at all interested. We don't have more questions right now, but I didn't I wasn't aware of the details around nuclear weapons being stationed in ROK, and that was a violation of the treaty. And I'm that's fascinating to me. If you have anything more to say about that, Jenny, feel free to unmute. Love to hear.
I think that Hayden really touched on an important point, which was, the United States bringing nuclear weapons into the region and the ongoing military drills in South Korea definitely were a threat. And I think that there's historic record of Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, talking early about if Japan could capitulate so quickly at the drop of a nuclear bomb. That's something we have to get to deter that kind of aggression against us in the future. And so I think the seeds were planted from Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I want to fully echo what Jenny is saying here. Thank you for that. Yes, I see it's 7:41 now. So again, I know I'm running over time, but does anyone have any other questions before we go into action bit? And thank you to those who have asked really great questions.
All right, and just for those of you who are not live on Zoom but are viewing the live stream somewhere else, this is where we're going to shut it down and begin our action portion of the evening, where we're gonna get some coaching on how to call in on the relevant bills and how to try to get our reps on. We're not going to stream that part, but do check us out at nhpeaceaction.org. In particular, look at our upcoming events. Every other Monday, we've got a program like this. And actually, for the next few weeks, it's every Monday.